A new report out today finds that the Greater Toronto Area's housing crisis could be solved by addressing the missing middle, the growing disparity in supply for types of housing, which include townhouses as well as duplexes. Joining us now is the author of the report, Paul Smetanin, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis. Good to be with you, Paul. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you,
What's the title of the report first? Because you and I were talking about this during the commercial break.
Sure. So, understanding the forces driving shelter affordability. So essentially the report is 3 years in the making. It's a big data exercise of looking at the pressures across the GTHA and Ontario on how much does the cost of housing and shelter actually take out of your after-tax income after other expenses. And using sort of 21st century machine learning and path-linked data, we were able to sort of, have quite an interesting exercise of looking at different municipalities, different household structures across the region.
So what did you find, though, in looking at all of this data?
Right, so we looked at over 40 different factors. Anything from speculation through to the development charges to electricity cost to food prices, all the way up to population growth and things of that nature. So by the end of the day, there's four major categories that seems to be driving affordability across the region. The first is population, demographics, and the changing household structure. So, for instance, across the GTHA, if the household number of people in a household changed from 2.6 to 2.5, you would need an extra 200,000 houses just to support that small change in a statistic. The second area was the importance of economic development. So the region has been suffering from stagnant wages, and there are generational income effects. That since the Great Recession, the bounce back in employment and wages has predominantly benefited the over 45, 50-year-olds as opposed to the younger generation. The last two categories are actually what we found the most interesting, is that we found a very big mismatch in the kind of housing that's available. We found that it's very small or it's very big, but there was that missing middle, what they call gentle density in planning, where you're talking about townhomes and duplexes and things like that. And we also found that half of Toronto, for instance, is growing and the other half is actually shrinking.
Growing in what measure?
In population. So while Toronto has seen a 250,000 person increase since 2001, half of the city has grown by 450,000 people, but the other half has shrunk by 200,000 people. And so when you have a look at those groups, you find that you've got the baby boomers and you've got the empty nesters sitting in single detached dwellings, but they're aging in place. And so part of the problem is they're not moving on. And when we survey them, they would like to move on. They would like to right-size, but there's actually nowhere for them to go. And that brings us to the fourth component, is rental. Is that home ownership rates in the GTHA are close to 70%. Home ownership rates. Now, think for a minute, in Paris, Munich, Vienna, 70% of those cities are actually rented.
Really?
Not owned.
Only 30% ownership.
Correct. So the pendulum has swung too far, it appears, on the ownership front. And so what we're finding as a well-diversified, desirable rental is necessary for a modern city to actually help its people move around. We live in a ownership-preoccupied culture, which is actually starting to conspire in terms of people actually upward bidding properties across the area.
Paul, some people would say, though, that to have ownership is something that you want for the long term, of course, because you don't ever want to be put in a situation or a position whereby the owner obviously increases the rent and you just can't afford that, particularly if you even think about the past 10, 13 years with these low interest rates and the aging population. They wouldn't be able to afford probably a rent increase. Now, we do have, or we're having, rent controls. Now, at the same time, too, though, rent controls, when I speak to developers, they're saying, look, if I'm going to be capped in terms of the rent that I can charge, and my costs might increase because one day we might get some inflation. That's not a good proposition for developers. So these new rules to kind of help a little bit about what you're talking about, even though we still need the development of these projects, you're not going to, I don't think you're going to see developers really move into that area. Is that a concern for you?
Oh,
when
absolutely.
You saw these rent controls?
Absolutely, and there's a lot there in what you just said.
I know,
So
about 10 topics.
Let's just back up a little bit.
Okay.
And let's actually talk about ownership. So, for instance, when you survey the population, you find that only 30% of people surveyed actually see owning their own home as a long-term investment strategy in their top three. Whereas 80% of the people surveyed see that owning your own home is a desirable thing. So in order for you to be able to get a house that you're hoping that suits you, works for you, serves your needs, in the country and the region we live in, you've got to buy that. You can't rent it. Okay? So when you have a look at since the 1990s, apartments have only grown by 3%, and yet the GTHA region's grown by 53%. Right? So
no
ownership,
rental apartments. No rental apartments.
Right, no rental apartments. Now condos have become the new rental, which has until recently become a free market force. But a third of condos are rented, and condos make up about 27% of the rental market in the region. Now, part of the problem is that because you have to go from ownership to ownership in order to find the kind of housing stock that would suit your purposes, it's a very expensive enterprise. And you've also got this issue of double coincidence of want. And that's why we have money, to avoid bartering problem. You know, my goat, your lettuce. I need someone who wants a goat, and you need to find someone who needs a lettuce. Whereas when you've got money, you get rid of that problem. Now in housing, when you've got such high ownership rates, when I sell my home, I have to have the double coincidence of finding someone who's selling something I'd like.
Right.
But then I've got to compete with essentially three kinds of buyers that show up. And the three kinds of buyers are people who actually want to live in a home, investors and speculators. So now, looping back around to your question, ownership is not necessarily, it may have been desirable for some generations, but it's now not desirable for all generations. We're finding that baby boomers are starting to look at this question whether they need to actually own or whether they can afford rental. Coming down to the 16-point plan by the Liberal government, it's unfortunate to see rental control enter the picture, because we've calculated that we need at least $100 to $150 billion of housing built in the next 10 years in the GTHA. And to move to modern city levels, most of that should be rental.
Okay. We have to leave it on that note, Paul. Good to be with you today. Thank you very much.